The final stage of an empath's patience is not anger. Most people get that wrong. They think the breaking point arrives with shouting, confrontation, or some dramatic explosion that everyone can see. They imagine patience as a rope that eventually snaps. But what nobody talks about is what happens before the snap. What happens when a person has spent years understanding everyone else's pain, excusing everyone else's behavior, carrying everyone else's burdens, and absorbing everyone else's storms. The final stage is not rage, it is clarity. An empath begins life believing that understanding people is enough to save relationships. They become experts at reading emotions that were never spoken. They notice changes in tone, pauses in conversation, hidden disappointment behind forced smiles, and sadness disguised as confidence. They become translators of human suffering. They learn to forgive quickly because they understand motives. They excuse harmful actions because they can see the wounds behind them. They stay longer than they should because they can imagine what another person has been through. And that is where the journey begins. The empath gives second chances, then third chances, then chances that no one is counting anymore. They tell themselves that people are struggling. They tell themselves that healing takes time. They tell themselves that nobody is perfect. They become the person everyone runs to when life falls apart. They become the safe place, the listener, the comforter, the rescuer, the one who stays. But there is something dangerous hidden inside that role. The more an empath understands people, the more they risk abandoning themselves. Every ignored boundary feels small at first. Every disappointment gets explained away. Every act of disrespect is softened by empathy. Every betrayal is wrapped inside a story that makes it easier to tolerate. And slowly, without realizing it, the empath becomes responsible for maintaining relationships that other people are damaging. Think about that for a moment. One person is carrying the weight, while another person is creating it. One person is making sacrifices, while another person is making excuses. One person is fighting for connection, while another person simply expects it. And because the empath is so focused on understanding others, they often fail to notice a devastating truth. Understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate their behavior. You can understand why someone lies and still refuse to accept dishonesty. You can understand why someone is hurt and still refuse to become their target. You can understand someone's trauma without volunteering to become another chapter of it. That realization changes everything. Because the final stage of patience begins the moment an empath stops confusing compassion with obligation. Something shifts. The same person who once spent hours explaining themselves suddenly becomes quiet. The same person who fought endlessly for understanding suddenly stops arguing. The same person who carried every relationship on their shoulders suddenly sets the weight down. To outsiders, it looks cold. To those who benefited from endless patience, it looks cruel. To people who never respected boundaries, it looks like rejection. But it is none of those things. It is awakening. The final stage of patience is when an empath realizes that their kindness was never supposed to come at the cost of their peace. This stage is misunderstood because it is silent. There are no dramatic announcements, no grand speeches, no attempts to convince anyone, just distance, just acceptance, just a calm understanding that not every battle deserves another attempt. And that silence confuses people. Why? Because many people are accustomed to the empath fighting to stay. They are accustomed to emotional negotiations. They are accustomed to being forgiven. They are accustomed to seeing patience stretched beyond reasonable limits. What shocks them is not the empath's anger. What shocks them is the absence of it, because anger still contains attachment. Anger still argues. Anger still hopes. Anger still wants change, but clarity asks for nothing. Clarity simply sees reality as it is, and once reality is seen clearly, there is no need to debate it. The empath finally understands something that changes the entire direction of their life. Not everyone deserves unlimited access. Not everyone deserves endless explanations. Not everyone deserves another opportunity. And most importantly, not everyone deserves the version of you that keeps sacrificing itself. This is the stage where guilt loses its power. For years, guilt has been the leash The empath feels guilty for saying no, guilty for leaving, guilty for choosing themselves, guilty for creating distance, guilty for protecting their energy. But eventually, they discover something remarkable. The guilt was never evidence that they were wrong. It was evidence that they were changing. Growth often feels uncomfortable because it requires breaking patterns that once defined us. The empath begins to see that protecting their peace is not selfish. It is necessary. And with that realization comes a level of strength that surprises everyone. Because the strongest empath is not the one who tolerates the most. The strongest empath is the one who knows when to stop. The one who knows that every door does not need to remain open. The one who understands that boundaries are not walls designed to keep people out. They are filters designed to reveal who respects your value. The final stage of patience is not emotional exhaustion. It is emotional wisdom. It is the moment a person stops asking, "How can I make them understand me?" and starts asking, "Why am I working so hard to earn understanding from someone unwilling to give it?" That question changes lives because once asked honestly, it exposes every one-sided relationship, every unequal exchange, every cycle of disappointment, every connection built upon sacrifice instead of mutual respect. And when those truths become visible, patience transforms. It is no longer patience for dysfunction. It becomes patience for your own healing, patience for your own growth, patience for your own future. The empath who reaches this stage becomes impossible to manipulate in the ways that once worked. Not because they became harder, not because they became less caring, but because they finally learned that caring for others and caring for themselves are not opposites. They are partners. And any relationship demanding the destruction of one for the benefit of the other was never healthy to begin with. So if you are standing in that final stage today, understand what is happening. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming clear. You are not losing compassion. You are learning direction. You are not giving up on people. You are giving up on the illusion that your suffering is required to save them. And that may be the most powerful lesson an empath ever learns, because the final stage of patience is not when the heart closes. It is when the eyes open. And once they do, everything changes. There comes a moment in every empath's life when the exhaustion can no longer be explained away. Not the exhaustion of work, not the exhaustion of responsibility, not even the exhaustion of difficult circumstances. It is a deeper kind of fatigue, the fatigue that comes from constantly pouring into containers that never seem to stay full. The fatigue that comes from being present for everyone while feeling increasingly invisible yourself. For a long time, the empath believes that this feeling is temporary. They tell themselves that things will improve once people appreciate them more, once circumstances change, once relationships mature, once loyalty is returned, once effort is reciprocated. But months become years, and years become chapters of life that can never be recovered. And one day a realization arrives with unsettling force. The people around them became accustomed to receiving what they never learned to return. That realization hurts because it forces the empath to confront something they have spent years avoiding. Not everyone who benefits from your kindness values your kindness. Some people simply value access to it. There is a difference. A person who values your kindness protects it. A person who values access to your kindness consumes it. One nourishes the connection, the other drains it. And until the empath learns to recognize that difference, they often find themselves trapped in cycles that repeat endlessly. The cycle always begins the same way. Someone needs help. The empath steps forward. Someone needs understanding. The empath provides it. Someone makes a mistake. The empath forgives it. Someone crosses a boundary. The empath explains it away. Someone disappoints them. The empath remains. And because they remain, the behavior continues, not always out of malice, not always out of cruelty. Sometimes simply because human beings adapt to what they experience repeatedly. If a person learns that disrespect has no consequences, they stop fearing consequences. If a person learns that forgiveness is guaranteed, accountability often disappears. If a person learns that someone will never leave, effort gradually fades. This is not because all people are evil. It is because people naturally invest according to what they believe they might lose. The empath eventually discovers that endless availability does not always inspire appreciation. Sometimes it inspires complacency, and that discovery changes the way they see the world. They begin reviewing old memories with new eyes. Conversations that once seemed harmless suddenly reveal patterns. Moments that once seemed isolated suddenly connect together. Excuses that once sounded convincing begin to sound familiar, and familiarity exposes truth. The empath notices they were often expected to understand everyone else's struggles, while very few people made equal effort to understand theirs. They noticed that their feelings were welcomed only when those feelings were convenient. They noticed that support often flowed in one direction. They noticed that their loyalty became expected rather than appreciated. And perhaps most painful of all, they notice how often they abandoned their own needs to preserve the comfort of others. That is a difficult truth to face because it requires admitting that some of the suffering was not created by enemies. It was created by patterns, parts repeated so many times that they eventually felt normal. Parts that disguised self-neglect as selflessness. Parts that rewarded sacrifice while ignoring balance. Patterns that convinced the empath that their value came from what they could give rather than who they were. But growth begins where illusion ends. The empath starts asking different questions. Questions that once felt impossible. What happens if I stop chasing? What happens if I stop explaining? What happens if I stop rescuing? What happens if I stop carrying responsibilities that do not belong to me? At first, these questions create fear because the empath has often built entire identities around being needed. Being needed feels meaningful. Being needed feels important. Being needed creates purpose. But there is a hidden danger in becoming addicted to being needed. You begin accepting relationships where your value depends entirely on your usefulness. And usefulness is not the same thing as love. A tool is useful. A resource is useful. A convenience is useful. Love is something else entirely. Love sees your worth even when you have nothing left to give. Love remains when your energy is low. Love respects your boundaries without demanding explanations. Love does not punish self-respect. Love does not require self-destruction. The empath who reaches this stage begins separating these concepts for the first time. And once separated, many relationships look different, very different. Some connections grow stronger because they were built on mutual respect. Others begin falling apart because they depended entirely on imbalance. This can be shocking. The empath may wonder why certain people react negatively when boundaries appear. Why does a simple no create conflict? Why does self-respect trigger resistance? Why does distance reveal so much? Because boundaries perform a function that few people discuss. They expose motives. The people who genuinely care about you may need time to adjust, but they eventually respect your limits. The people who only benefited from unlimited access often become frustrated the moment access changes. That frustration is information, not revenge, not proof of your failure. Information. Information about expectations that were never healthy to begin with. The final stage of patience involves learning to trust that information. Instead of arguing with reality, the empath begins accepting it. If someone repeatedly shows indifference, believe it. If someone repeatedly breaks trust, acknowledge it. If someone repeatedly takes without giving, recognize it. Not because people cannot change. People absolutely can change. But because your responsibility is not to build your life around who someone might become. Your responsibility is to respond to who they consistently are. That lesson creates freedom. For years, the empath may have lived inside potential friendships, potential relationships, potential apologies, potential growth, potential change, potential effort. But potential is not reality. Potential is a possibility. Reality is a pattern. And patterns tell the truth more reliably than promises. The empath who reaches the final stage of patience becomes less interested in words and more interested in consistency. Less interested in intentions and more interested in actions. Less interested in possibilities and more interested in evidence. Not because they became cynical, because they became wise. Wisdom is not the loss of hope. Wisdom is hope guided by observation. It is compassion balanced by discernment. It is kindness protected by boundaries. And perhaps the greatest transformation occurs when the empath stops measuring their worth by how much they can endure. For years, they may have worn endurance like a badge of honor. They survived betrayal. They survived disappointment. They survived neglect. They survived emotional storms that would have broken many people. But survival is not the highest goal. Thriving is. Healing is. Peace is. The final stage of patience teaches that strength is not proven by how much pain you can tolerate. Strength is proven by how much truth you are willing to accept, even when that truth hurts, even when that truth changes relationships, even when that truth requires letting go. Because some endings are not failures. Some endings are graduations. They mark the completion of lessons that can no longer be learned through suffering. And when the empath finally understands that, they stop chasing closure from people who cannot provide it. They stop seeking validation from those who never understood their value. They stop begging for reciprocity from those committed to imbalance. Instead, they turn inward. They rebuild. They reconnect with parts of themselves that were neglected while caring for everyone else. They rediscover dreams that were postponed, goals that were abandoned, passions that were forgotten. And for the first time in a very long time, their energy begins flowing toward creation rather than repair, toward growth rather than recovery, toward possibility rather than survival. This is where the next chapter begins. Not with anger, not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with a quiet and unshakable understanding. The empath's greatest power was never the ability to absorb endless pain. It was the ability to learn from it. And once that lesson is learned, the future no longer belongs to the people who drained them. It belongs to the person they are finally becoming. The transformation becomes undeniable when the empath reaches the point where silence feels more powerful than explanation. This is one of the most misunderstood phases of the journey, because people who have always known the empath as patient, accommodating, and endlessly understanding often expect one more conversation, one more warning, one more opportunity to make things right. They expect the same cycle to continue because it always has, but something fundamental has changed. The empath is no longer trying to convince people to see what they have repeatedly refused to see. For years, they explained their feelings.